The book River Remembrance, written by Krupa Ge in conversation with Professor Yogesh Dubey. I would like to request Ms. Krupa Ge and the Professor Yogesh Dubey to come on the dais of discussion. Let's initiate them with a round of applause. Before we going ahead, let me introduce you the author and speaker for the session, Ms. Krupa. Ms. Krupa is an author of the novel What We Know About Her and a narrative, non-fictitious book, River Remembrance. Krupa, ma'am, received an Lardli Award from her column on women in cinema. She was awarded the Jayanti Resident in 2017, the Toto Sangam Resident Fellowship in 2016, and was shortlisted for a Toto Prize in Creative Writing. Our next discussion is Mr. Professor Yogesh Dubey. Mr. Yogesh is a wildlife biologist, holds Master in Wildlife Science from Aligarh Muslim University and PhD in Wildlife from the Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun. He is currently working as the professor at Indian Institute of Forest Management since 2001. His area of interest in human-wildlife conflict management, wildlife conservation, biodiversity's inclusive impact assessment, and sustainable tourism. Talking about the book which shall be discussed on this session is the River Remembrance. This book is about the flood water, sewage, and the remain of the humankind greed that swallow a whole city in December 2015. A city drowned when forgotten rivers and built over lakes came back to reclaim what was rightful theirs. So let's initiate them with a round of applause.
So a very hot afternoon. Bhopal is exceptionally hot in the later part of the March, which usually it is not. I feel privileged to be part of this session and discussing a very, very important subject that we often neglect. We are all touched upon by this almost everywhere, every year, everywhere, wherever we are, in varying degrees. But it is only on the basis of the amount of pain that we have, the pain that we face as an outcome of our interaction with this particular element of natural system, basically that decides as to, what kind of memory does it leave? What kind of impressions does it leave in our minds? Floods. It's part of a natural catastrophic system. Happens almost everywhere wherever there are river systems, wherever water flows, and wherever water flows in larger quantities, where we are not able to manage the flow of the water for X, Y, Z reason, certain level of flooding is going to occur. Chennai floods, we all know, was in news for not just a day or two, but for weeks altogether, and did raise multiple questions in terms of the overall governance of our riverine systems, the way we handle, the way we treat the water. Water is a life giver, a life saver. But the book does tell us that if you do not respect water in the form that it exists, and if you interfere too much with the natural systems, they are going to give it back. So with that, I would actually start with the title. When I got this offer that I need to discuss this book, almost for 15 minutes I kept looking at the title. Rivers are part of an abiotic system. I'm a biologist. River is not a living being. Water is not a living being. It's an abiotic element of the ecosystem. So how can water remember? So my first question to Krupa is, how did you finalize that this should be the title of your book?
Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction. I'm very happy that 3 years after this book came out, it's still relevant, and I'm also sad that it's still relevant. I came up with the title of the book from, in 2005 there were those Mumbai floods, which was really devastating, and at that time there was an article that went viral. It was titled "Rivers That Remember and Cities That Forget," And this is something that it stayed with me for a while. It was written by Vikram Doctor, who's usually a food columnist, and then he'd written about this, and then it went viral, and that title had stayed with me all those years. And then when I was thinking of a title for this book, and I thought, well, I need to call my book this, because I felt like we have forgotten something, right? And that is what is haunting about this flood. And for me, it was also the question of people keep forgetting that there are floods that happen in Chennai almost every decade. As I was just telling you, we remember in Chennai that there's a water problem. Every summer we get ready with, we clean up our water tanks. We know that there's going to be a water shortage. But somehow there's no cultural memory of there being floods. But there have been floods, as I've traced in this book, from, when the city was founded itself. It was a made-up city. Such a city didn't exist. The British created the city. There were small hamlets and villages. And so from the time that the British have been here and they created the great institution called PWD, which, is responsible for everything other than taking care of the things it's supposed to take care of, there have been records of floods. And so I wanted to play on the idea of memory itself. And, they say that water has memory, but of course it doesn't. But
Okay, all right. So, my second question is that to be able to, develop so much of motivation to write a book, you are a journalist. I would have expected that you could have probably written a column in some newspaper about the Chennai floods. But what motivated you apart from, the book does mention that you begin with a personal front that, mom, dad got caught in the flood, and that is how it began. But I'm sure, that would not have been, motivation big enough to, start writing a book which has so many facts, accumulated in it, so many facts that have been stated in it. So when did you finally get motivated that, no, I must write a book on this subject?
Right. When the flood happened, I was caught totally unawares, as was everybody else in the city. And I was really angry, and I needed some way to sort of show the anger that was building up, because I could see that my parents suffered, but then I could see what was happening to my city, right? And this is a city I've called home all my life, and I could see what was happening to the place I'd grown up in, the streets, and I can't tell you how devastating it is. You grow up in a street that's supposed to be this beautiful haven, and then it's been devastated, sewage all over it. Inside your home, there's sewage. That kind of thing can shake you up. But I'd wanted to become a writer by that point, but I'd always thought, I'm going to write stories, I'm going to write fiction. But I think this event sort of gave me I felt like I need to give myself the permission to write other things as well. I can't only say a writer cannot just be content with the worlds inside their head. They have to be concerned about their streets and their homes and their cities.
I think you began with a very right note and on something that will always remain contemporary. Given the way we are developing, the way our infrastructure is changing, not just in city of Chennai, almost across the length and breadth of the country, stormwater management is going to remain one of the biggest challenges for all cities. All cities. I still remember, my wife is sitting here. A couple of years back, we were driving down in the months of monsoon, and close to one Choraha, Nehru Nagar Choraha, there was a lot of water that was accumulated. My kids were very small. I was driving my Alto car, my first car that I bought out of my salary, and suddenly we realized that my car was in the middle of water, and water started seeping inside the car from the doors. My son was very small, my daughter was very small. They virtually started crying because they could feel the water, on their feet. Even I got tensed. That what is going to happen. Somehow I was able to pull through, and when I came back home, and I decided to see what all I have brought in with me, and as I cleaned my fenders, right from sanitary napkins to sanitary pads to large number of plastic, and the most disturbing thing was perhaps a lot of fecal matter. Because when cities flood, the sewers, they ooze out. And all that comes and get mixed with the water, and God knows where it goes. I mean, nobody's able to assess, what kind of impact that it can basically, create on the natural ecosystems of the cities, urban ecosystems, for a prolonged period of time. As I was reading a book, there's a term that you use, tyranny of distance. And I really found it very interesting that how these natural disasters can play with the distances. That's something that is... So, how much did you see this happening in Chennai during the floods?
Oh, a lot. First of all, we're so far away from the national media, and so I'm sure Bhopal experiences that as well, right? Because everything is Delhi or Bombay. Rest of India doesn't really exist for the media. And so when something happens, it takes that much longer to get the attention of the media. The importance of that attention is actually that then the resources get diverted, right? Until that happens, everybody is a bit like, we'll see what happens. That is the first one. The other distance really was, I was living 15 minutes away from my parents, and there was no way for me to contact them. There was no way for me to know if they're alive. There was no way for me to know if my house had drowned. I was thinking actually that they're fine. But then I got a phone call at 4 in the morning, and they said that the house had flooded and that they'd run upstairs in the middle of the night, to save themselves. And they could say whatever they did, but my father could have easily slipped and fallen in the water, or anything could have gone wrong, which it did for a lot of other people during the floods. And so that distance is something that you don't expect when you live in a city that is so connected at other times. The only thing that was working was one BSNL landline in that entire building of 32 apartments, and no cell phones were working, towers were flooded. So it was impossible to communicate, and that was the hard part, actually.
Dams and reservoirs, as they are being made, traditionally also, apart from making water available for multiple purposes, one of the key objectives also is that these dams and reservoirs are meant to, they're seen as a tool for flood control. So with so many reservoirs around Chennai, how did it go wrong?
This is the part of it that's called a freak accident, right? So there's this huge buildup of cloud that happens right above where the reservoir is, and it just pours non-stop, and it is rain that we've never seen, that kind of a rain. And we almost came close to seeing it again this last December, because they kept saying it's a once in a 100-year rain, but I think they've forgotten what exactly a once in a 100-year rain means, because it came again almost, so it just sort of poured on top of the reservoir, which goes to show that maybe we need to rethink how we do these reservoirs and where we locate them, and what exactly their purpose is, because it was the reservoir that was going to flood the city.
So, how did the Chennai Metropolitan Authority, react to your book?
By ignoring it.
Quite unusual thing that, happens. So post floods, did either the Chennai, Metropolitan Authority or any municipal corporation that exists over there, did they, then, engage further with the citizens out there in terms of, preparing them for any such eventuality in future, any capacity building, any trainings that are being carried out?
Unfortunately, very few lessons were learned from that flood, and very little by way of actually, equipping locals has happened. And whatever has happened has come from people. There are certain areas that have these very proactive residents' welfare associations. They've gotten together and they have tried to figure out what happens again. We don't want this to happen again to our street. What do we do? And so they work with the administration. But right now, I feel like they've sort of, after this, again, there is another flood that has come. I think now they've realized that we can't just say that, this will never happen again. This could come back again and again. And so there has been some investment that's happening in managing floods and understanding the impact of climate change in Chennai, what it's going to be like going forward. And some investments on that are happening. But there's this word that I hate that we use a lot in India, it's jugaad. right? Now there is jugaad for climate change also, because this time when there was floods, I saw they'd invested in almost 200 to 300 motor pumps. So as soon as a road would flood, the motor pumps would come in and pump the water out and send them straight in. So instead of making sure your road doesn't flood, there is now water pumps that come to your door as soon as it floods. So we're there, but hopefully we'll get better.
So how was the food and other essential supplies? Normally we see whenever there are floods, the army, the paramilitary forces, they immediately swing into action to ensure that at least, because food and water, these are two very important things in floods. I mean, there is water all around, but unfortunately that water is of no use. I mean, you can't use that water for any of the purposes.
Yeah.
So during the Chennai floods, especially in the initial days, what was the overall situation of food and essential supplies?
See, the administration took care of those who were already in, those shelter homes who had been evacuated. But large parts of the city hadn't evacuated. And there was extreme communication gap at that time. And so the rescue operation didn't start 2 days after the floods. And so it was locals who stepped up. They set up community kitchens and they cooked. And then boys from IIT took a boat and went into the area in which my parents lived, and they gave them food. And my father told me, for the first time in my life, I stood in a queue and took food and water, and he was grateful for it. He was grateful for the kids who came, because they're all old, they're diabetic, they have blood pressure, they need to eat, and there's no electricity, so you can't have water in your building. And so they caught rainwater and they filtered it, and then they boiled it, and then they drank. And so for the first 2 days, it was a complete breakdown, and it was the people of Chennai city who were really the heroes who came together and did it.
Your book, very significantly highlights that a lot of these wetlands and waterborne areas have been severely encroached upon, over a prolonged period of time. So is this one of the factors that probably plays a very important role whenever there's a heavy rain in Chennai?
Right.
And there is no place for water to go and get stored.
Yeah.
So it's basically, water is probably getting stored where it is supposed to get stored in the floods, but those are also the places that are occupied by the, human settlement.
Exactly. In fact, the CAG report on the floods mentions this, that one of the major reasons for the flood is the encroachments that have happened in the areas where the water is supposed to run off. Unfortunately, the establishment itself has played this role. As you were mentioning, we also in Chennai have, on these wetlands, huge constructions where they want to, so they say we're going to beautify your rivers. So they take all the people who live along the banks of the rivers and then they go and put them on wetlands. They construct those huge apartment buildings and tell them, no, you go and live there. And because all that area is free outside the city. And so they've taken people from along Chennai's rivers and rehabilitated them on top of wetlands elsewhere where water is now stagnant.
So, the normal practice is wherever you have these reservoirs and whenever you get these warning signals, especially when the water is about to reach the FRL, then there is a systematic way of start releasing water so that the excess water can then be accumulated and, flooding can be prevented. So I was reading in the book that there's a mention that the water was supposed to be released from this, Chembarabakkam reservoir into the Adyar river, in the last month of November, and I think there was some forecast also. So why did this not happen?
Tamil Nadu is a very unique state in that, even to open the reservoir, the chief minister has to come and say, okay, yes, now I've given you permission, you come and let the water out, because everything is seen as a political act, especially water is such an emotive subject. We have the Kaveri, so everything is very emotional around water in Chennai. And so at that time, our former chief minister was there and she ran a very tight ship. Everybody knows that. And so there was a huge delay just in sort of getting permission from the administration, from the chief minister herself. She was unwell, that's what we come to understand now. But there was huge delay from that, in terms of just getting an okay to release the water out. and they waited until the last minute, and then a job that an engineer could have done perfectly well got botched.
So every state, has these. You have also mentioned multiple times in a report, in your book about the State Disaster Management Authority. And when you use the word authority, it means that you are being authorized. I mean, that is why you are an authority and you are supposed to act. And this is, all states have these, high-powered committees, high-level committees to deal with the disaster-related issues. So, I mean, what went wrong where? I mean, the state executive committee, was it that there were too many, players to deal with the disaster?
No, it's just, it was defunct. In fact, the entire disaster management act, I think, sort of came in the aftermath of tsunami, which affected, Tamil Nadu so badly. And to think that the state disaster management authority didn't even meet, even in the aftermath of the flood, they didn't meet. Between the 3 months when there was heavy monsoon going on, at that time they didn't meet. It was basically, the crime of being absent, basically.
There has been, very important revelation in your book in form of that the state disaster management plan was a cut copy paste of the state disaster management plan of Himachal Pradesh. And, I teach environmental assessment as a discipline, and I very often, come to know that this particular EIA has been copied from that EIA of this dam. There are multiple cases from state of, Tamil Nadu and state of Karnataka where environmental assessment of one dam has been copied by some other agency. So, but this is very enthralling that the disaster management plan from an Himalayan state has been copied for a coastal Indian state.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is this fact known to the Chennaians?
Yeah, I don't think so. Because this whole event happened because I came to know because I was following the court proceedings for the book around the floods. And so because the court was after the state to form this, come up with a new plan, come up with a better plan, and to see what they were doing for the floods. And so in their hurry to sort of submit to the court that they had, and to show as if, they have done some work, the state just sort of copied Himachal's. And so there's mention of snow and ice.
Obviously, they are glaciated rivers. Tamil Nadu has non-glaciated rivers, and the flood system, the way the water flows, they have more flash floods that are specific to a particular season. Yeah. Chennai might not experience, flash floods.
Yeah, landslides.
Landslides, and there's, a lot of muck and, slurry that also flows in. And so what happened to this? I mean, how did then court, what kind of, stand did the court, take with response to this cut, copy, paste of,
I think they were pulled up for it afterwards, but...
so has it been revised?
Yeah, I think at this point it has been revised, and now there's much more cognizance of climate change itself in the Tamil Nadu State Disaster Management Plan, and at least the word flood appears a few times now in it.
Okay. While we were talking about food and essentials, health,
Right.
because floods, they bring with them, during the floods and post-floods. Usually epidemics follow, post-floods because of the kind of conditions that has been created. So what kind of healthcare management system was pressed into action in Chennai during floods and after the floods?
Well, during floods, as I said, it was every man to himself. But after floods, that is where you saw the efficiency of, the famed Chennai's administration, as well as the efficiency of, it being the medical capital, in a sense of the country. All of that you could see in action. There were medical camps all over the city, and there were doctors who were actively involved in, providing medical aid and making sure that some extremely serious cholera breakout or a malaria breakout, something like that does not happen. And so that is one area where the administration sort of really sprung into action, and they contained, it's a great point that you brought up, that it could have gone into, a really bad space now that we've seen the pandemic, but they contained it really well. That part we have to give it to them.
Ma'am, could we open a stage for audience question?
You have to just tell me, and I would then close and open the. I just few more questions to ask, and I think we'll be very brief.
Of course.
And, next thing, during the times of such crisis, the non-governmental organizations also play a very important role. So in case of Chennai floods, were there some active NGOs that came forward?
Oh, yes. There were many NGOs, and one in particular that I've written about was an NGO run by the Sri Lankan refugees, the Tamil refugees who are in Tamil Nadu from Elam. And they beautifully organized, because they understand what is at stake, and they've seen extreme cases of somebody losing their home, and they know what exactly that means. And so these volunteers went in, and as interior Tamil Nadu is there's a very serious caste problem, and it's a very segregated sort of space, and there was huge trouble in reaching aid to Dalit colonies during the floods. And so these NGOs played a great role in actually making sure that aid reaches the disabled, it reaches the oppressed and the marginalized, because they were being stopped from getting aid.
There are multiple stories that you've shared in your book across, they cut across multiple sections. But one of the stories that really I liked amongst all of them was Dr. Bala's story. And she being a doctor and the kind of problem that she had to face. And would you want to, I would want you to share a little bit with the audience in terms of, this is just a story of one nursing home.
Right.
She created a nursing home somewhere, and the amount of problem that she had to face, our hospital went
under
shut
the water
down, then open, then you re-sanitize it all over it again.
Right.
She had, 4 or 5 cases with her where the deliveries were supposed to happen, transferring those women now, struggling to find places where she could, transfer those women into other hospitals.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Dr. Balakumari is a gynecologist who has a hospital of her own in a very low-lying area in Chennai. And when she bought the land for her hospital, she didn't know that it was so low. And she said the first monsoon, while her hospital was being constructed, she saw in the next plot that lilies were beginning to bloom. And that's when she realized that she'd been sold a plot inside a lake. And she didn't know until then. But then she had invested too much of her money in it, and she had to continue building her hospital. And then during the 2015 floods, the hospital flooded. And as it flooded and there was power cut, there were 6 pregnant women inside the hospital who were all about to deliver, one with a complication. And Dr. Bala struggled because it was so low-lying, nobody could come to help her. And, after a lot of fighting, and she stayed in the hospital with those women in the flood, and she saw snakes and scorpions wading through the floods inside her hospital, that she finally found an ambulance driver, and she told him, "You're my God for the day. You have to take these women to safety." And then he took them to safety to various hospitals and got them all admitted. And there were still post-operative patients inside the hospital that she took care of. And now she's invested in, a vehicle called Gurkha, which is an all-terrain vehicle. And it's not something you need in a metropolitan city like Chennai, but she's invested in that as her ambulance now, so that, she's prepared for a flood anytime now. So
Krupa, I'm going to ask you the last question before we open the floor for more questions from the audience. So if you have to sum it up, how did the Chennai flood impact Chennaians on economic, social, and ecological front?
It was devastating in all 3 fronts, and even psychologically. I think people in Chennai are now scared of rains, and they ask the administration questions now. Hello, what are you doing now? So, people are very aware. And economically, I think I've written about it. It was a huge hit for people to take, because several industrial estates were washed away. First generation, entrepreneurs who were setting up small businesses, medium businesses, all of their equipments washed away in the floods. And, many of them were able to recover the cost with insurance and things like that. And so economically, and, in terms of infrastructure, it really brought to the fore everything that was wrong, that was being neglected in the city. We could see that encroachments were happening. We could see that buildings were being built, apartment buildings, fancy buildings were being built right on water bodies. And, everything that is wrong became crystal clear to us during those few days. And I would not wish it on any other city, and which is why I wrote the book as well. But I wish there were people I'm glad that, people of Bhopal can now also hear about it, because I would like no other city in India to go through what Chennai went through for those few days.
So thank you, Krupa. And now the floor is open. There's somebody who's wanting to ask a question to Krupa. Please be as brief as you can. Don't club too many questions in one question. Sir, please.
My question is for both of you. You see this wetland issue which I came halfway, actually I was not there in the beginning. It's a major issue. It is affecting every town. Builders are manipulating land records. And there should be a national vision now. It is, I would say, when you talk about India's environmental problem, this is a major problem. It is there in every city, every town, every village. कहीं भी ऐसा छोटा सा पॉन्ड पड़ा हो, वो आपको थोड़ी देर में बढ़ता हुआ दिखेगा और फिर वहां पे कुछ खड़ा हो जाएगा. इसके लिए अपन क्या कर सकते हैं?
There has to be a national wetland conservation policy.
No, but
all the water crisis,
Supreme Court has commented on this, yet it is not happening.
So, this has to happen. Half of the water crisis problem in this country is because the water recharge is not taking properly.
That is what I am
saying. Because the wetlands are being encroached upon. So, this is the big issue for the governance. Kandekar Saab has raised his hand. I'm sure he will have something very important to share and tell us.
Not very important, but my friend Uday Maurkar has raised a very important question. So I was just wanting to say that the Ministry of Environment and Forest has revised the wetland rules, and state wetland authorities have been created in some of the states, if not all, including in Madhya Pradesh. I am the member of that state wetland authority. But the fact remains that the issue what Mr. Maurkar has raised, and perhaps you could also think of that whether it is Bangalore Lake, whether it is some kind of rainwater spilling over to the roads and Gurgaon getting jammed. So issue is of urban planning and issue is of implementation of the rules. And more importantly, now we have got about 15,000 wetlands in Madhya Pradesh to be restored, or that is our mandate. We don't have money. That is I'm saying this thing, I'm not a government person, but I'm on the wetland appointed by the Madhya Pradesh government, considering my work in Indore for last 22 years of saving a wetland, and the municipal corporation and the ownership of wetland. All these issues are involved in spite of the fact that the government has notified wetland rules and has created wetland authority. But more, she can say more about it, Krupa Ji.
In Chennai too,
you.
the entire IT corridor has grown around a wetland. And so all the high rises, all of the buildings, the marshland, it's called Pallikaranai, the marshland has shrunk beyond recognition. And so it's as if they look in the map, and as soon as they see a wetland, they see those dollar signs in their eyes. And they say, this is where the money is.
I think wetlands will have to be notified. The way we notify protected areas, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, there has to be a gazette notification that should come from each state that this is being notified. There has to be a satellite image map. It has to be satellite image based map, not just a paper map. It has to be marked on the map. The areas have to be marked on the map. Unless such kind of notifications are being issued, and they will have to be seen in the larger interest of the urban areas only. We live in Bhopal. We know what kind of water crisis Bhopal gets into. I see tankers running all over the place in the month of April and May. People have big houses. They have built houses worth ₹1 crore, but they do not have water in their house. The water is coming from a tanker. It's coming from somewhere outside. Whereas, if things are managed properly, you would still be able to maintain enough groundwater that you will never fall, shortage of water even in the leanest of the season. It is basically just because we don't have a clear-cut guideline, a policy. It has to be a legal policy on the conservation and preservation of, especially these ephemeral and small-time wetlands. The bigger lakes, of course, will still be able to survive, but the smaller... Yes, ma'am, please.
No, I just wanted to say there is some problem even with this protection. Listen, the moment there's a question of notification and what happens to what is not notified. So we face this in heritage conservation, and we find that only those monuments, then that becomes an excuse to encroach upon things which are not notified. So that more than just notification and legal approach, there has to be a multi-pronged approach. And the Nagar Nigam has to be given a much larger role in all this. And the responsibility seems to, because Chennai, I think, had 49,000 tanks at one time.
I mean,
49,000.
It is a city of tanks only, tanks
So,
and reservoirs.
just think of it. And today you get floods.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's
We have
a
floods and
shit.
we have droughts. We
Yeah,
have nothing
yeah.
else in between.
In fact,
We
there's a
have-
mention in the book about one of the reservoirs where the protocol for the flood management had not been revised. I mean, since the time it was made, probably during the times of Maharajas and all, they were routinely and regularly, maintaining
Repaired
the...
and
yeah,
maintained.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So there has to be a joining of hands of several bodies. So not just heritage. I will give the mic to Madhu after that.
Yeah,
there has to be a cross sectoral approach. One, then you don't talk about notification, but you talk about all the bodies.
In
who are
Tamil Nadu, there has been some success wherever the community has gotten involved.
Yes, exactly.
yeah,
and
city will
Nagar
have to be
Nigam is
involved.
our body from where. So one may think about it, but whatever doesn't get notified suffers because it gives you a legal, reason to kind of
to sort of,
encroach upon
them
it.
and use them the way you want.
So, and if you will allow me, I'll just
Yeah,
give
sure,
the mic
sure,
to
sure,
Madhu.
please. So that's going to be last questions.
So I worked on these wetlands. We're sitting right now, and that made me heading the Committee of Technical Management Committee of Wetlands of Delhi government. So connecting to what Khandegar Sahib has just said, the ministry is notified, new rules have come into being. But ironically, it talks only about natural wetlands, not the man-made and artificial wetlands which come into being. So what we have done, the first stage, you rightly said, they have to first of all notified, otherwise they don't have any ownership. There are agencies which are managing so-called wetlands, no ownership is being held with these, organizations, these, agencies. They have to be notified first. And the whole kind of, information to be created to make a case of notification. Like you rightly said, the GIS maps to be created and layers to be, put into being and ecosystem services, many things will come into being. So in Delhi, only one wetland to my knowledge so far in the country is being properly notified. None of the wetlands in the country are notified wetlands where you can exercise rights for creating management plans and fetching funds to get a legal status done and fetching management funds for managing these, wetlands in future. So 5 wetlands are being notified right now, 10 are also in being, but we made it a case to bring in, as Dr. Meera Das was saying, other wetlands as well.
It has to be
Which are
through
not natural wetlands.
stakeholder
So, exactly,
consultation.
exactly,
The way we
exactly.
declare the critical wildlife
Exactly,
habitats, where
yeah.
the villagers, the panchayat,
exactly,
everybody comes together and decides that okay, this is critical,
Yeah,
needs to
exactly,
be protected.
Exactly.
So multiple stakeholders will have to be
Yeah.
involved. And one of the problems with the wetland is, a couple of years back I was working on one thermal power plant assignment in the state of Madhya Pradesh only. And towards the end of my assessment, I was told that there was one reservoir out there, and this reservoir would be used to dispose of all the fly ash. And it was with the revenue department, and I said, how can you get these reservoirs? They said, no, it's with the revenue department, and revenue department has given us NOC, no objection certificate, that they have no problems in this, and it's a huge wetland. Huge wetland. It's a man-made wetland, but it has been in existence for quite some time. So all man-made wetlands are actually now natural wetlands only.
Exactly.
I mean, Bhopal Talab, we can't call it as an artificial lake.
Yeah.
It's an ecosystem that has evolved over a period of time. And this is, one of the very, very important subjects. And I see there's one more book, that is talking about, floods and fury. We will take that last question because I think...
Sir, we are run out of time, sir.
Sir, I'm so sorry. I mean, if there's somebody asking, yeah, you were the first. Okay. Sir, आप आगे आ जाइए तो हम, yeah, I mean, sometimes these lights and all, they create a lot of...
I happen to be from Bhopal, and there is a small river that originates from Bhopal Lake, Kaliyasur. It meanders through the city and then goes into Betwa. Now what happens is, there are remedial measures possible if you stop building houses in the area which is quite close to the river. There is a mandate about it. But what happens is the people flout that, and the NGT is no more than a scarecrow in this matter. What happens is there are houses which are supposed to be demolished because they are quite close to the river, and there is a particular area which is supposed to be left alone. Now what happens is, this being a state where mostly you are in the election mode, so the chief minister himself goes and says, koi mail ka laal nahi hata sakta us building ko. Then what can you do?
So the rest of the discussion can take place after.
Yes, sir. Thank you for wonderful and nice discussion.
Thank you so much. But before I end this session, Krupa had sent this book to me by courier that I got 3 days back. And any book that comes from the author, if it does not carry an autograph of the author, remains incomplete. So, sir, before you, give this gift to Krupa, I would want my book to be autographed right away here. Photo, please. And no copy for the organizers?
So now I would like to request.
Such a wonderful cover, and I would strongly recommend it's a
Yes, sir.
beautiful read. It's a beautiful read that will take you through an emotional journey that as to how floods can actually influence lives of people and what kind of memory they can leave for times to come. It's a wonderful and amazingly beautiful read.
So there is a memento for our author. The painting is made by Padma Shri Bhuribai, an eminent and fine piece of art.
I have recently acquired, you got a book and I got a cap. And the cap is from Ila Foundation Pune and Dr. Satish Pandey is a top ornithologist. And if we keep talking about wetland without birds, it's not possible.
It's not possible.
So I have.
They both complement each other. This is my second month. So now me and my wife can happily sip our coffee together in this DLF mugs.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.